Coming up on Chasing the Natty, spring practices, scrimmages, and games galore. What do we do with all this information? In addition, we're going to discuss some players with some hybrid positions and roles in their offenses that make them a little difficult for us to gauge what to do with them in college fantasy. To help us all with this, we're bringing on our first guest of the month in Nicholas Ian Allen from CFBWinningEdge. All this and more coming right after this.
Cutting, mesmerizing run by the quarterback.
Marvin Harrison Jr. touchdown. Marvelous
Ball next to the end zone, dropped in for Franklin. Oh, majestic touchdown.
This is Chasing the Natty, a college fantasy football podcast. All right, welcome in everybody. This is Jared Palmgren, host of the Chasing Natty podcast. I hope you guys are having a wonderful ride to your work on this Monday morning. I am back. Really appreciate Nate and Mox for taking on the show last week. Huge favor of them on my end because, again, I have been working and dealing with my thesis all week. Good Lord, if I ever have to write a 400 plus page document ever again in my life, please slap me and tell me to get into a different line of work. Again, really appreciate you guys tuning in. If you want to support what we're doing over here for college fantasy, make sure you go over and subscribe to CampusToKent.com, where we have all of your written tools and everything you need for your CFF, C2C, and Devy fantasy needs. Got a ton of stuff coming your way. Be sure to be tuned into all of that over there. We got a lot of stuff. And if you want to support us even further, make sure you follow myself on Twitter at CFF_Jared. You can also follow the show's Twitter at Chasing the Natty. And make sure you comment, like, and subscribe on this YouTube channel. We do have a goal of hitting 1,000 subscribers by the start of the season. We're still a little ways away from there, so I need y'all to start reaching out to your friends and telling them to come over here and subscribe. And if you're listening to this on podcast, make sure you go over there and follow us wherever you are listening. And make sure you leave those 5-star reviews on whatever platform you are listening to. With all that out of the way, we're getting the spiel out of the way early today, guys, because we got a ton of great stuff to get to. And to help us all with that, we have the wonderful creator of the CFB Winning Edge page, Mr. Nicholas Ian Allen, coming on to help us today. Nick, how are you doing today, sir?
Doing great, Jared. Thanks for having me on.
I would say, I think this is your first time on the actual show of CTN because you came on last year for one of our live mock drafts, which we'll be doing again this year. But yeah, I think this is actually your first time on here. So again, we got a lot of great stuff, spring practices, stuff like that. Nick, we talked a couple weeks ago about like research strategies, like how to keep up with all the news and everything for like college fantasy and everything. But your spreadsheets and everything are really like the gold mine of just keeping updated with all the different information you could possibly do, roster movements, who's going to the NFL, who's staying, who's transferring, who's doing what. How do you kind of keep up with all of it?
A lot of Google alerts, a lot of emails to myself. You just kind of have to accept that you won't be able to catch everything, but try to pay as much attention as you can and make notes, write everything down. And yeah, you mentioned I've built some Google Sheets. I have some just ridiculously, some might say obscene, just Google Sheets is a page for every FBS team, try to track depth charts and transfers in and out and all that good stuff. So I've set up a little bit of an infrastructure that at least I've gotten used to, able to make some changes pretty quickly, stay on top of those sort of things. But yeah, just try to take in as much information as I can and react to it quickly and whatever I miss, hope to catch as quick as I can after.
There are just so many things, like I could go to this page and just quickly look up. Like I use your sheets for helping me research all the time for this show and everything, because it is such a great overview of everything that has to do with the team. You do a great job in the season with all your betting and everything. You do a lot of projections with these sheets, with the calculations you make. definitely worth subscribing over to CFB Winning Edge. Great content over there. That's pretty much all I have to say. Again, lots of great stuff here. Pretty much anything you want to look up, you will find here. Again, whether it's some recruiting information like the 247 rivals ratings, you can compare and contrast all the different stuff. You can look at all their height and weights are updated. How many years of eligibility a player still has. That has easily been one of my favorite things to quickly go over to Nick's stuff and get. So definitely go check out all of his stuff. With all that buttering up, Nick, I say we go ahead and get straight into today's show. We are going to be covering some spring and camp roundup. Again, a lot of practices, but a lot of scrimmages really happened this past weekend, so a lot of great stuff from that. And then a couple of spring games have started kicking off, and that's going to be pretty much the bulk of shows moving forward and everything, learning what we can from those spring games. But a few only this weekend, and then afterwards, Nick, you had a great... we were chatting the other day, and you had a great idea to talk about different players who are kind of, shall we say, just weirdos in college fantasy, where like either their positions just feel wrong in terms of where they're being put on fan tracks, or they are just kind of those hybrid ones where you don't really know how they fit in different roles in the offense. We'll be discussing about 9 to 10 of those players later here today. But first, let's go ahead and get started into spring news over here, Nick. We'll start off over at Ole Miss, where we got some open practice. Thank goodness. Can more schools do this, please, where we have open practice? People can just come in, watch them play. You don't have to do... It annoys me to no end whenever a school says, like, oh, we have a spring game, and that spring game is just basically an open practice. Like, no, if you're going to do a game, do a game. Do what Bama, do what Georgia, do what Michigan, and all of them do. Way more fun for the people who are coming in actually paying to be there. Anyway, rant over on that. Ole Miss here. Quarterbacks pretty much the same, it sounds like. Dart continues to run with the ones. Sanders is running with the ones and twos, kind of working his way with both. Howard fully with the threes. He's definitely their guy of the future. I doubt he plays a major role this year unless both Sanders and Dart get hurt. Dart seemed like the best of the day. 8 for 12 for 179 yards and a touchdown. Also had 3 rushes for 31 yards. I don't really count those too much in like scrimmages because you can't really touch the quarterback anyway, so ignore that. Sanders had a little bit rougher of a day. 11 for 21, 129 yards and a touchdown. And then Howard had a pretty similar day. 11 for 17, 120 and a touchdown as well. Receivers, we kind of talked about last week. Really kind of... Did Nate talk about this last week? I think he did. But Chris Marshall was said to be running with the threes. Well, at this practice, he was running with the ones. It was him, J.J. Henry, and Jalen Knox were the 3 starting wide receivers. I put down in my notes, where is Trey Harris? I found out after I wrote that note that Trey Harris has been injured throughout most of the spring, so that's why he probably hasn't been running with the ones. Kind of a bummer for him because, again, like he was such a stud at Louisiana Tech. Anyway, I'm hogging the mic here. Nick, what are your thoughts on what's going on over here at Ole Miss?
Well, first of all, you mentioned, love that it's an open practice. I do have a little bit of a coaching background, so I kind of understand from their perspective, trying to limit access as much as you can. But now in the line of work I'm in, certainly, love having more access than less to try to figure out, these personnel issues. And obviously, quarterback being a big part of this one. I was doing some, digging through my notes earlier this week, and sometimes things that are fairly obvious I'll miss or forget about. And Jackson Dart having just one rushing touchdown last year kind of jumped out at me. We will see, I think, or at least there's an opportunity maybe for whether it's Dart or Spencer Sanders, some positive regression there. Mm-hmm. So maybe whoever wins this job right now, at least, in some of the early best balls that I'm doing, neither of these guys are, top 20 round guys. I mean, they're right there on the fringe, late teens, maybe early 20s. And for me, I think I like hearing that Jackson Dart is still with the ones. I understand Spencer Sanders being as experienced as he is, but was of course banged up last year. Seems like Dart, in my opinion, has a chance to hold on to this, but it is going to be a question for a while as to whether or not he's actually going to be able to keep the job if he does in fact open up as the starter. But not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but one of the guys who could potentially come up in our later conversation, Jalen Knox is one of those players where, context for these guys is important. And I think something that we'll try to, hit home a little bit later on, but he's a guy who had 9 rushing attempts last year, 78 yards, didn't get in the end zone, but they have a little bit of a unique role for him. And so it's, important to try to figure out who are some of those unique players who have, some roles that could potentially limit some upside. And Jalen Knox didn't necessarily wasn't the one who limited Jackson Dart to just 1 rushing touchdown, but maybe a guy like JJ Pegues who had some rushing attempts in his past, other guys who get in the mix down by the red zone are going to be factors for that. But this, specifically for, Ole Miss and practice reports, I struggle with it a little bit. I find myself wrestling with sometimes reports. I think it's great. And of course, you guys at C2C do a great job. And I know Matt Bruning does his spring camp reports, which are very, very valuable. But I find myself, thinking, all right, it's important for me to know who's running with the 1s, who's running with the 2s. But then I also look at the calendar, and as we're recording, it's April 2nd. Yes. There's so much time for all this to work itself out. So I try not to pay too close attention in some instances, but it is important to keep an eye on these things as well, and kind of have an idea where the pecking order is right now, but still understand there's plenty of time for it to work itself out.
So I'll touch on 2 points you made there, and we kind of had this debate a little bit in the Slack as well, where like how much do you value spring camp information this far out? I have a rule where I do if it's one report that a player had a good day, or like one scrimmage where a player broke out and everything, I file it in the back of my head, but I never like really kind of change things. If I start hearing steady drum beats about a player, whether it is a wide receiver who consistently is a go-to target for the player or for the quarterback, or a running back that maybe wasn't set to be the starter, but they continue to flash week in and week out, that is something that will start to kind of change, because that to me shows consistency, and it means that they're probably earning themselves a bigger and bigger role each time. Going back to the Ole Miss over here, again, you kind of talked about how both Spencer Sanders and Dart are going later in drafts. Sanders currently going as the QB 52, Dart going as the QB 62. It's kind of funny. Like, a lot of people kind of sit there and say, like, oh, well, Sanders has the higher upside of the 2 because he has a more rushing potential. But everybody forgets that Dart, again, he rushed for almost 600 yards last year. Again, like you said, Nick, if he positively regresses just a little bit, again, like if you assume like a quarterback for every 100 yards they run, they should get a touchdown, that's 5 additional touchdowns that Dart would be looking at next year. Maybe he doesn't, because like you said, Ole Miss likes to do some unique things around the goal line, but even still, just an additional 3 or 4 back towards that, like that expected line that you would expect. Great job on that one, Jared. It's so interesting just how Sanders is going 10 spots ahead, even though, again, we're seeing that Dart does have the number 1 spot currently. I want to say locked up, but currently he's there. Interesting other things here. Both Trigg and Prescorn are running with the 1s. You are looking at a lot of 12 personnel. Trigg, he's back. He's healthy. He's once again starring in spring practices because he's got himself another springtime touchdown yesterday. And again, I don't want to be sucked back into this, but man, do I like Michael Trigg. So who knows? We'll see. Any last minute thoughts, Nick, before we move on to our next school?
Well, I'm with you on Trigg. I mean, he's incredibly talented. Unfortunately, he's had some injury issues that have impacted him the last couple of years. But it makes a lot of sense to me that Ole Miss would try to get both of those guys on the field, he and Preeksorn together. And that's, something I'm sure we'll touch on as well. Just because maybe a team hasn't utilized, 2 tight ends very much in the past, or has done something. Again, it's important to know that history. But, sometimes people make changes, and when you have 2 arguably top 5 tight ends in the country. Find a way to get them on the field at the same time. So it's good to hear that Trig is up and performing in spring practice, and hopefully we'll be able to stay healthy and carry that over into the fall.
Yes, sir. All right, let's go ahead and move on to Purdue here. Not really a ton to report here. They had a scrimmage this past weekend. This one, unfortunately, was not open to the public. In fact, it was very closed off. But it sounds like that Hudson Card has pretty much locked up this number 1 QB spot. Again, I don't think that really surprises anybody. Walters, once again, he has said this twice now that he believes that Card has the chance to be special. I don't know how far I'm willing to go with that because, again, I like Card. I don't know if he's really special quality, but we'll see. Another thing is, again, steady drum beats. I look for that. Once again, I'm hearing that TJ Sheffield was said to be a standout in this past Saturday's scrimmage. So to me, he is somebody that I am probably grabbing in the later portions of a lot of drafts because, again, yes, Graham Harrell has not really lived up to potential as an offensive coordinator, but we did see that guys like Bryce Ford Wheaton, at least to start the season, and for things to be, if things do stay consistent, you could have some really, really productive wide receivers in that system if they are able to get it going pretty early. And Mr. Sheffield is very much steady Eddie for this offense. Last little note here, Tyrone Tracy seems to have solidified himself as the RB2. Behind Devin Maccabee. I think we'll talk about him definitely a lot later, Nick. So we'll save Tracy for later. But Sheffield and Carr, do you have any thoughts on those guys?
Well, so a lot of the work that I do is, I think, useful for CFF, but it's not necessarily built with CFF in mind. So take that into account here a little bit as well. But I look at a team like Purdue, who has been productive at the passing attack specifically in years past, and Nate, of course, has mentioned this and does a lot of great work on coaching change. It is important to know that there is a coaching change there. Walters is a defensive-minded head coach. They did bring in Graham Harrell, as you mentioned. He's had a little bit of a bumpy road, the last couple of years. And one of my numbers that I like to turn to is team performance, what I call team performance. It's a lot of advanced stats go into a calculation. And West Virginia last year ranked 98th in passing team performance. So just not a very efficient passing offense. Less raw numbers, which are a little more useful in CFF, but really struggled there, and a little bit better on the rushing end. They were 47th. So maybe that's some good news if you're talking about Tracy or Maccabee. But maybe, you would expect a Graham Harrell offense to, be better in passing categories. And last year at West Virginia, they really struggled. First year there, first year at Purdue. I'm not super optimistic about Hudson Card right now, and part of that is because Graham Harrell just hasn't really been on a great streak here in past years, and I am a little bit concerned that Walters is a defensive-minded head coach and a first-year head coach, which is always something to be aware of too.
I mean, it does help that, again, he at least went out and got a truly offensive-minded guy for his offensive coordinator position. He clearly sees that, hey, that's where I'm limited. Let me go get a guy. Whether that's going to work out or not, we'll definitely see. But, again, some names to file away there at Purdue. Let's get away from the Power 5 for a second. Let's go and talk about a MAC school where we actually get a little bit of information. Shout out to JD Yankee for finding some nuggets here. And plenty of good discussion to be had here. So recently, Western Michigan, in an interview, center Jacob Gideon said that the pace of play is going to increase greatly under Coach Lance Taylor. And Gideon specifically said that they're going to run 80 to 100 plays per game. That feels like a big exaggeration because only 3 teams in all of FBS had over 80 plays per game last year. That is Oklahoma State, Buffalo, and Texas Tech. I have a fat doubt that Western Michigan will get there in a single year, maybe year 2. But regardless, clearly it is a goal of theirs to be going faster, to get more points, to be more aggressive on offense. So the question now remains, who do you draft? Because nobody's left at Western Michigan. Sean Tyler, gone to Minnesota. Corey Crooms, also gone to Minnesota. You have Ladarius Jefferson, he's gone. So who does that leave left? Well, you got two quarterbacks who are locked in competition with each other with Bourget and Salopek. I think I pronounced both of those names right. And then of your wide receivers, I have one that I kind of like. Again, I like Jelani Galloway. He's a 3-star transfer coming in from Boston College, 28 catches last year. And the thing about this is that Billy Kosh, their new offensive coordinator they brought in from Richmond, very much focused on the passing attack, had 3 receivers last year at Richmond with over 70 receptions. That stat brought to you by our wonderful Nate Marquise's coaching change articles. Go check all of those out. So, Nick, who is there anybody you're kind of looking at, maybe targeting here? Because clearly there's some things built here that an offense could be pretty productive, especially if this is a bad MAC team. They're going to be forced to pass the ball a whole ton. So are there any wide receivers that you kind of like here?
Unfortunately, right now, I am staying away. It is good news that Western Michigan is ramping up the pace a little bit. That's quite a change. Last year, according to my numbers, which look at the time between snaps for pace, Western Michigan ranked 95th. So it's quite a change. Mm-hmm. I wasn't impressed really with either quarterback last year. One number that carries a lot of weight for me is yards per pass attempt. Pretty simple, mm-hmm. But both of these guys, Salopek, Jack Salopek was 6.06 yards per pass attempt last season, and Trayson Bourget, 5.5. Both guys were under 50% completion percentage, which can certainly be misleading. But I wasn't impressed with either guy, and they really will need to get better quarterback play, in my opinion, for either of those wide receivers, to be valuable. That said, the change in offensive coordinator, sometimes you can inject new life. Certainly, there's a track record at Richmond, as you mentioned. So I think that there are some positive signs, and the wide receiver group is a little bit more established. Obviously, they lost Crooms, as you mentioned, but Galloway, 50 plus targets last year. Maybe he or Sambucci.
Galloway had 50
forward.
plus targets last year and only caught 28
targets.
Catches.
Exactly.
Yikes!
Yeah, 0 touchdowns. So and that's quarterback play is a big part of that. And so maybe Western Michigan is a post-spring opportunity for a quarterback transfer that
could be
is possible if they were to be able to bring in a experienced Power 5 former talented highly rated recruit. Maybe that would interest me a little bit more, but right now, and it's definitely an inexact science, because you're installing a new offense, new head coach, first year head coach as well. There are some things where you can kind of talk yourself into it, and hearing the pace is going up is something that we like to hear in CFF. But also, again, I try to find context, and when I think it can be valuable. Western Michigan ranks dead last in FBS in defensive returning production. So mm-hmm. I could see a scenario where you're operating at a really high pace, don't have good quarterback play. That makes me think a lot of 3 and outs. Mm-hmm. Then you hand it over to your defense, where they maybe are not good enough, can't get off the field, and you're just in a bad spot where nobody is producing on the offensive side of the ball. Western Michigan might just be a bad team that maybe we're not going to see a valuable piece. That said, I'll definitely be looking for more information, looking for some follow-ups on this, looking for some notes on if one of these quarterbacks is kind of taking charge, taking control of that job, and that might benefit a guy like Galloway or Sambucci. Or are they, even though they're operating at a fast pace, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be super pass heavy, even if the offensive coordinator or play caller has shown that in the past. Maybe a guy like Zahir Abdus Salim who has flashed at times in the past. Maybe he becomes, a valuable piece as a big time.
Didn't he have one of the
workhorse type running back?
One of the least efficient performances
Yes.
in the country last
well,
year?
The stat line from last year, not great, obviously.
He was like 2.2 yards per carry or something like that.
Yeah.
Yikes.
Yeah. Slightly below 2.2 yards per carry.
Oh no.
0 touchdowns and 46 attempts. But he, he showed some good things in the bowl game 2 years ago. And then, last year they had Tyler, they had Jefferson. So he wasn't a big part of that offense. Maybe he takes a step forward. Maybe he's a beneficiary here. But I right now am just not super optimistic.
No, fair enough. And the good news about all of these Western Michigan players is the fact that none of these guys are going very high in drafts. So if you do want to take a shot on one of these guys, wait until the very last round of your draft and you could probably take a shot on them. Let's go ahead and talk about Ohio State over here. Nothing really in terms changing when it comes to like your top wide receivers, running backs, quarterbacks. I think we all know those names. I do think it is worth talking a little bit about, and this is a little bit more CFF dynasty than it is really the just CFF redraft, but I think it is interesting to talk about. Carnell Tate, man, wide receiver, 5-star, 4-star, depending on where you look. One of the fastest players to ever lose his black stripe this early, and he is still, as far as I'm concerned, the only freshman to do so far at Ohio State for this year. That is very impressive given some of the receivers that they're also bringing in with this year. Brandon Immis has not gotten onto campus yet, so who knows whether he would have lost his black stripe as quickly as Tate did. But as far as I've heard, Tate's already running with the twos. They already got Noah Rogers running with the twos as well. They got Bryson Rogers, which I don't think anybody should you'd never count out any Ohio State wide receiver, really. But again, they have a very talented group coming in, and already Tate is standing out from the rest of this group. That puts him up my board a little bit more for dynasty purposes than I was really having him before. That because again, this black stripe kind of is a symbolization of like, hey, this is a dude who's doing everything right. He's bought into the team. That's the kind of stuff I like to hear. So Nick, because it's not redraft, really quick thoughts on Carnell Tate, and then we can move on to some Arizona schools.
Yeah, I think this is one of the most important pieces of information you can get out of these spring practice reports. Ohio State, of course, has a lot of guys sitting out this spring.
Yes.
But that creates opportunities for these younger guys who might not impact this year, but as you mentioned, for dynasty purposes, great to know that Tate is impressing. Probably won't be able to count on him this year, but a lot of great signs moving forward.
Yeah. Alrighty, again, not too much out of Ohio State. Definitely was just worth talking about Carnell Tate there for a minute. But let's go down to Arizona. We're going to talk about both the Arizona schools today, but let's talk about the Wildcats first. Big thing here that I took away from practice reports recently is that Jonah Coleman is said to be bigger and faster than last year. This is a freshman that a lot of us liked going into last year, but he couldn't quite overtake Michael Wiley. Michael Wiley ended up being a top 30 CFF running back last year. He was one of my favorite guys this year to kind of grab in mid-rounds, somebody that seemed to kind of always be flying under the radar a little bit, has been rising a little bit. But these camp reviews of Coleman have been absolutely glowing. And to me, if Coleman keeps this up, both of these guys' ceiling is going to be capped for this upcoming year. Other thing to really kind of look out for is that, man, Jacob Cowling, we all know he's going to be great, but man, Tetariah McMillan, the 4-star freshman wide receiver from last year, already performed well last year. With Dorian Singer out the door, he looks like he just completely stepped up in that role as the clear number 2 guy for this offense. And honestly, I think he could give Cowling a running for the wide receiver 1 position this year, considering his talent level. Regardless, it seems like the Wildcats are going to have 2 productive wide receivers again for CFF. These 2 have separated themselves completely away from the rest of the room. Nick, your thoughts on the Wildcats and some of these offensive pieces that they have?
Yeah, I was surprised. Went back and looked just how well Michael Wiley performed last year, sort of under the radar, super productive season.
It was.
And it is a little bit alarming is not the right word, but do need to be a little bit cautious, because I saw that and was like, oh wow, yeah, I'm definitely way too low on Wiley. But as you mentioned, Coleman is back and getting rave reviews in camp. Rayshawn Luke was not healthy last year, but he was playing when he was, and he'll be back in the mix. And DJ Williams, taking advantage of the extra year of eligibility.
I forgot he existed.
Yeah, and Jaden Delora had 4 rushing touchdowns last season. So to me, that's a pretty crowded situation. I think for team wise, a good sign for Arizona, but for CFF purposes, probably we should worry a little bit about Wiley's ceiling. But definitely do love to hear that McMillan is performing really well. Cowing, I know, is going really high. I think he's still second rounder or so in ADP. And there are certainly great numbers, just raw numbers. Maybe there's a little bit of a concern if you dive a little bit deeper that he struggled down the stretch, also didn't perform particularly well against the better teams that Arizona faced. And then McMillan is a big target, 6'5", 6'4", something like that.
Yep.
Which obviously is not Cowing. So maybe he has a little more upside as a red zone target and things like that. So I do think that McMillan is probably somebody, at least in the drafts I've been a part of, who's maybe a little undervalued right now, at least compared to Cowing and compared to this Arizona offense as a whole, which we're hearing good things about Jaden Delora, some steps that he's making, and McMillan, at least as far as a piece of the production puzzle, piece of the pie, probably has an easier path to a high performing season than maybe somebody like Wiley, who's now competing even more for carries with guys who are impressing in that backfield.
Yeah, I'm trying to look at the ADP of some of the Arizona guys here. McMillan is going as a wide receiver 26. Cowing, of course, going in the top 7 wide receiver. Yeah, he's wide receiver 7. But McMillan, like you said, I think he's a little undervalued here. Again, you're talking about a guy who's been on average going in the 7th round compared to Cowing, who, again, I love Cowing. I think he's going to be an absolute monster this year. But, honestly, it might be a little worth it to just kind of pass on him and maybe take McMillan later. I have a feeling McMillan's going to rise as the season kind of goes along here. And then where else are some of the other... Yeah, Michael Wiley, talking about a guy who's going in the 11th round. I think that's still pretty fair for him. Even if his upside is a little capped, he's still, with Jonah Coleman last year, got a top 30 running back performance there. He may not quite get back to that this year. Jonah Coleman's taking more carries away from him. But at the same time, I think that is definitely a pretty fair value for him because, yeah, he's going as a running back 44. And then I'm curious, where's Delora going? What are you doing, buddy? You are... I can't find him.
Yeah, he seemed a bit low in some of the best balls and things like that.
Quarterback 28. So he's currently going right where Wiley's going. So he's in the 11th round as well. Let's go talk about their rivals across the state here. Let's go to Arizona State, where, man, oh man, Jalen Conyers' hype has been on full steam ahead lately. It feels like it's like every other day I'm seeing a highlight tape of Jalen Conyers just completely mossing somebody in practice. Quite the steady drumbeat here. I like Conyers last year. I think he had a pretty respectable line, 38 catches, 422 yards, 5 touchdowns. The thing here, though, is that with Dillingham coming in and establishing a new offense there, he has a history of just locating and finding his best players and finding ways to get the balls to them. His system, as far as I can tell, doesn't really prioritize outside guys, inside guys, or anything like that. It's just who's the best guy. Let's get him the ball in different ways. I think that Conyers is currently kind of setting himself apart from the rest of the receiving options at Arizona State. As far as I can tell, again, there's some good options there. You got Elijah Badger. Xavier Guillory has definitely been impressing over there. But, man, just the way these guys talk about Conyers, it really kind of tells you that this is the kind of guy that I think you should start investing in a little bit more. Again, let me look up where Conyers is going in ADP. He is currently going as the tight end 20. I have a feeling that's definitely going to be rising over the next couple of months, especially if we continue to get, like I said, consistent praise from the coaching staff with him. Nick, your thoughts on the Arizona State pass catching options here?
So I've certainly seen some highlights, seen a lot of buzz about Jalen Conyers, and it's impressive. And I do think that he's probably been a little bit undervalued to this point. I think, and I feel bad about this. I feel like I'm throwing cold water on some of these.
Please do.
I feel like he's very quickly going to move from underrated to overrated.
So basically the Michael Trigg route.
Well, potentially. I don't know if he's going to get quite that high, but we'll see. Like you, I've seen a lot of glowing Arizona State reports. Xavier Guillory specifically is somebody, it seemed like the first 4 or 5 practices was the first name mentioned in reports that I saw. But one thing that I think is important to notice, a little bit of context, and this is part of my struggles with spring as a whole, so I'll try to be brief here, but spring practice is a zero-sum game, right? Mm-hmm. If the offense looks great, the defense probably looks bad.
Yes.
And there is some evidence to suggest that Arizona State is potentially a little bit more on the bad defense side of things. They rank 126th in defensive returning production.
Oh, no.
And certainly there's a lot of new pieces coming in, and so they could get up to speed relatively quickly, but they weren't a particularly great defense last year. I mean, that's an understatement. They ranked 121st in defensive team performance. So they were bad defense last year, bad pass defense last year, ranked, not bad, but 67th. So not great on pass defense team performance, but they're just very, very young as well. So this is probably not a very good defense. So that might benefit some of these offensive players a little bit. Dillingham being an offensive coach probably benefits them a little bit. And then one maybe sneaky bit of the puzzle, I think, is Messiah Swinson, tight end, who's also back, who is 6'8" and had a couple of touchdown catches last year. Only had 15 receptions, 23 targets, but he potentially might eat into a little bit of Conyers' upside. I've heard some good things, about Swinson as well. Okay. Conyers, very impressive this spring. Seen some highlights. I know Nate tweeted out, where he mossed a big DB the other day. But I think, it's important to take all the context. Maybe we should be just a little bit cautious before pushing Conyers all the way into that elite tier or close to it, because there's some other things to consider.
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect, Nate. I love it. Did I call you Nate, Nick? That's perfect, Nick.
Close enough. Nobody would have even noticed.
I guarantee you they did. Anyway, let's go ahead. Let's go back to the Big Ten. We talked about Ohio State earlier. Let's go back over there. Let's talk about Illinois. Nick, I'm gonna do this all podcast now. This is not gonna be good. Nick, I know this probably breaks your heart a little bit because I know you were kind of looking at this running back room, trying to figure out who's gonna be that next guy. Brett Bielema, man, has been very vocal about the fact that he wants to move away from what they did with Chase Brown last year. That had a lot more. He's been saying that had a lot more to do with injuries, and that he has a good 2 to 3 back rotation for them to use for this upcoming season, specifically between Josh McCray, Reggie Love, and then Caden Fagan is the new freshman running back coming in this year that a lot of people are very hyped about. He's probably going to find a role as well. McCray, if I remember correctly, let me look up his ADP real quick. Oops, that's my bad. Give me y'all a second, y'all. Just need to get back to the... There we go. Make sure I never do that again. All right, McCray is currently going as the running back 37. So given our information here, it's nice to think that we can just always pick the next guy up in different systems. But when we have the head coach specifically saying we are not doing that again, McCray at running back 37 definitely feels a little bit high. He's going to need to come down. What do you think, Nick?
I'm disappointed in this news. I personally am pretty high on Josh McCray. I think I took him in the maybe the very first mock that you read in like the 7th or 8th round. I was really impressed by him when he was a true freshman in 2021. And I know the numbers aren't, don't necessarily jump off the page, but he just ran incredibly powerfully. A big running back, but also I think, flashed a little bit of speed, didn't, at least didn't look super slow. And then last year, he just wasn't healthy. And so I know we got to see him a little bit, and, he didn't look great, didn't look healthy, didn't look, fast or that impressive last season. But I was, I guess, sort of assuming, at least hoping that he would be 100% and maybe have the inside track to take over in what I hoped would be, a pretty big role coming into the year. To hear vocally repeatedly, over the last week or so, how much they want to spread the workload a little bit is concerning to me. The fact that the most recent thing I saw specifically said that Reggie Love right now looks to be, the guy at the top of the depth chart, even though it still, signs are pointing toward a committee. The quotes have mentioned that, Bielema likes a committee and has done it in the past. And that's, true to an extent. I mean, in way back in 2014, when he was at Arkansas, they did have multiple 1,000-yard rushers.
Yep.
Both of those guys, Jonathan Williams and Alex Collins, had double-digit touchdowns. So there's still, some value there. Maybe even both guys could potentially have value if we're thinking they're going to be anything like that. But after that point, I mean, there were times where, he leaned on Alex Collins the following year, 1,500 yards and 20 touchdowns. And the next closest guy had 90 attempts and less than 400 rushing yards. Raleigh Williams had a big year in 2016 at Arkansas when Bielema was the head coach there. And they've changed a little bit. Barry Lunny Jr. is not, obviously wasn't the play caller back in those days. And so perhaps I was getting a little too caught up in, my impression of McCray a couple of years ago. And it is, I think, a fair point that, Chase Brown was a pretty special running back. And, when you have a guy like that, you do lean on him a little bit more. Maybe the situation's just not the same, and I shouldn't have assumed. But man, I like McCray. And so I'm sad to hear these reports that I've heard this past week, but certainly, should I think this is one I do personally need to file away and keep in mind. And I still might grab McCray, but maybe I'll be able to get him in, the mid-teens instead of in that 7, 8, 9 round range where he was going initially, partly due to me.
Yeah, no problem with falling in love with a certain guy and being willing to pay up for him a little bit. And like you said, even if they are splitting the carries and everything, there is still the possibility that maybe they do have multiple guys. Maybe it's not funnel it all to Chase Brown, but you can split the workload between the guys, and maybe you do have multiple 1,000-yard backs here, in which case both McCray and Love would be two guys that you'd want to have in your CFF teams. But I don't know if Illinois is going to be able to do that. Granted, he was able to do it with Arkansas, so who knows? One last little spring camp update here. This one will be real quick. Over to Wisconsin, a little nugget. Shout out to Corey P. Pereira, our Devi lead here at Campus of Canton. He put out a tweet talking about how CJ Williams, just out of nowhere, just kind of overtook Shimre Dike in practice recently, where he was just absolutely dominating with the twos, and they brought him up to play in the slot with the ones. I have a feeling that they're going to still find a way to get DK and Williams out there at the same time, but it is striking to me that this is a former borderline, this is a former 4-star recruit coming over to Wisconsin, a team that has not had a ton of talent at the wide receiver position. Him moving up this quickly is something to note, especially in a Phil Longo offense in that slot position that we all have loved over the past couple of years where Josh Downs has been sitting. What do you think about this, Nick, real quick?
I think this is good news. There were some concerns that CJ Williams, wasn't getting much action, at least with the starters early in spring camp. I thought perhaps some folks were overreacting to that a little bit, feel that his talent would eventually win out. So this is good news that it's happening maybe even faster than we previously expected.
All right. Let's go ahead and talk about some spring games. Again, spring games, Mal, it feels crazy that we're already pretty much in spring game season. Like, the next couple of weeks are going to be absolutely nuts with the number of teams that have spring games. We'll do our best to cover all of those, but for right now, we only have 3 to cover. A good variety here. We got BYU up first. We'll get to Michigan. We'll get to Southern Miss in a second. BYU, nothing super surprising at the quarterback. Slovis is your number 1 guy. JUCO transfer Jake Ratzlaff is your number 2. If you, like me, are not a big fan of Keaton Slovis and think that he might wash himself out at some point this year, definitely a guy to keep an eye on is Ratzlaff. Aiden Robbins and Soljay were both out during this spring game, so that leaves Hinckley, Rapati to deal with the ones, and Miles Davis, who a lot of people are kind of falling in love with a little bit last season, he's still running with the 2s, so that tells me he's pretty much out of it. If you got Robbins and Soljay out and he's still running with the 2s, that tells me don't invest too much there. I think this is unfortunately looking like it could be heading a bit towards a committee approach if Robbins is not out there getting the reps this spring like he needed to. And in terms of wide receivers, Cody Epps was out, and you had Nyberg come up and replace him in the Splot. Good Lord, I can't speak today. So much fun. Anyway, 2 guys on the outside are the 2 we expected, Keanu Hill and Chase Roberts. Chase Roberts is the name I think we need to be watching for in this BYU offense moving forward. You are talking about a guy that is extremely speedy, able to take off the top of a defense, and BYU does love taking their deep shots. In addition, he has gotten the endorsement from former standout wide receiver Puka Nacua. Shout out to CF Froton for getting that little nugget while they were at the NFL Combine. He gave a specific shout out to Chase Roberts, and recent reports have said that Roberts just continues to look more and more like a true number 1 wide receiver for this offense. I have personally moved up Roberts recently, and I think that, quite frankly, people need to start opening up a little bit, because I've seen Epps, I've seen Keanu Hill get drafted. It is very rare when I see Chase Roberts being considered the number 1 guy, and that has to change. Nick, your thoughts?
Great news on Roberts. He performed, got out to a really strong start last year. Had a 100-yard game against Baylor, and looked like he was on his way to a really strong season. Unfortunately, got hurt in late September, missed some time. Only had 2 receptions after week 3 until late October, when he came back and got a little bit more into the swing of things. So I think seeing him back and healthy and hearing the good reports, that's really, really positive. I was impressed at different times by Cody Epps and Keanu Hill last year, so I'm not ready to write them off altogether just yet, but I do certainly agree that Chase Roberts has been really underrated, and somebody who's been somebody that you could get at a really strong value. I think he will be a factor, and if he takes over, if we can expect a similar usage profile to Puka Nacua, I think that's important to know, because Puka Nacua had 5 rushing touchdowns last year, which tied for the lead among guys who were primarily wide receivers. So again, something we'll talk about a little bit later, but if there's a little bit of a hybrid role that somebody like a Chase Roberts or one of these other guys, if they factor in there, we're going to want to know who it is. So good to see that Roberts is back and fully healthy. Otherwise, I'm always very skeptical about what comes out of BYU as far as coaching reports.
Fair point.
We've heard in years past that, like, oh yeah, these 2 are in a dead hit. Zach Wilson, right? Didn't all into the fall. I was like, oh, he's neck and neck He might not even be the starter, and then he goes out and has a historic season that makes him top NFL draft pick. So
the Drake May experience.
Right. So we've had that in the past. It's kind of interesting to see the complete opposite here, where it's like, oh yeah, Slovis is our guy. Don't worry about it. Maybe not verbatim, but that seems to be what they're suggesting here. So I'm a little bit skeptical when it comes to coaches' quotes coming out of there.
Okay.
BYU has evolved at different times. They've had running back by committee at times. They've had guys where they lean on one. They've had high end quarterbacks that have been in position battles. They've had now a guy who's on his third team and career trending in the wrong direction, who seems to be number one, and it's just a battle for the number 2 spot. So I'm going to hold a little bit of a wait and see approach. I do think that Aiden Robbins is probably going to be the guy who's going to emerge as that running back number 1. But is his upside limited? Maybe. But the big takeaway, I think, as you mentioned, is good news for Chase Roberts, and somebody that we forgot about a little bit when he got hurt last year. So I think he's somebody that's certainly going to climb up rankings and draft boards.
To your point about other wide receivers on this team, one thing we have to remember is that BYU is moving to the Big 12. That is going to be a more difficult week in and week out schedule than they are used to, which means that probably the offense itself is going to be a little bit more capped, but it is also going to force them to pass a lot more, because that defense is going to be tested more than it has seen in their independent schedules in the last couple of years. So I still think Chase Roberts is the best guy, but that doesn't mean that guys like Keanu Hill and Cody Epps can't also be relevant. Again, we see every year there are tons of offenses that have more than one guy who are relevant on a week-to-week basis. And so don't hear what I'm not saying. I am saying Chase Roberts is your best bet. I would still probably take the shot on guys like Keanu Hill and Cody Epps if they are coming at a fair price compared to where Chase Roberts is going. So let's move on.
Real quick.
Oh, go ahead.
To interject there. I totally agree. Keep in mind the conference change. That's an important factor. They will be facing more talented defenses week in and week out. I would push back a little bit. We shouldn't assume they're going to pass more. Sometimes when you're playing a more talented opponent, from a coaching perspective, it makes more sense to shorten the game, limit possessions. So maybe they will take a 240-pound running back like Aiden Robbins and really ride him, slow the offense down a little bit to try to keep the score close, get into the fourth quarter. So we can't just assume they're going to pass more, even if they're playing better competition. It's certainly a possibility, but there are scenarios where they actually pass less, in my opinion.
So I'll ask you, Nick, because you're more in tune with this side of the ball than I am. How's BYU's defense looking this year? Because if it truly is just a place where that defense can't stop anybody in the Big 12 because of them moving up and everything like that, at that point it doesn't make sense to slow the game down, because you're not going to be able to slow the game down.
Well, I mean, if you have a bad defense, part of the how do you make an offense, or excuse me, how do you improve your defensive numbers? It's keep your defense off the field, and so specifically, BYU last year performed really, really poorly defensively. As far as experience goes, they're middle of the pack in returning production this year. They do have a new defensive coordinator who was a longtime winning head coach at the FCS level.
Okay,
so I think, to me, that's a little bit of a positive sign. They were impacted by injury last year, especially at the linebacker position. 3 guys that are probably, going to play a lot of snaps at linebacker this year missed big portions of last season due to injury. So I do think the defense will be, should be better. I mean, they'll also be facing more talented, opponents moving into the Big 12. So it's difficult to say specifically, but there are some positive signs, I think, for the BYU defense. Experience isn't a major red flag right now, but last year's defense was really, really bad. I think they will be a little bit better.
No, absolutely, and makes all of the sense. Let's go talk about the Michigan spring game over here. Again, in terms of CFF potential for this year, I don't think there's really much to take away from here. McCarthy kind of had an up and down game. If you like him, you probably weren't put off that much by yesterday's performance. If you didn't like him, nothing happened yesterday to where you're now all of a sudden aboard the McCarthy train. The future of the running back situation for Michigan from a CFF dynasty perspective is definitely something to kind of consider here. They got some pretty good options moving forward. You got Mullins, you got Orgy, but yesterday the star of the show really was not true freshman Cole Cabana like a lot of people are kind of expecting coming into this year, but true freshman Benjamin Hall had 13 carries, 96 yards, and a touchdown. Now, granted, he's going up against the second and third team on defense, so you take a lot of that with a grain of salt. But if you're going to do that, you better dominate them, and 96 yards and only 13 carries is definitely showing that you can dominate that performance. And in addition, Michigan has some pretty good tight ends in that room. Again, like Georgia, I think has the best tight end room in the country, but man, Michigan, I don't think is that far behind. Colson Loveland, AJ Barner, they bring in from Indiana. Hibner as well kind of showed out in this game as well. Would have had a touchdown had he not been tackled by the turf monster about 10 yards from the end zone. Those are kind of my takeaways from the Michigan spring game. It was a little hard to kind of dissect with Corum and Edwards being out. You didn't quite get to see the full offense running there. Nick, did anything kind of stand out to you from the Michigan spring game?
Not really. It's one of those where, and you alluded to it, you probably saw whatever confirmed your priors. If you have concerns about JJ McCarthy, you saw some reasons to think, oh yeah, well, he looked a little shaky there, had the bad interception. But then if you are pro JJ McCarthy, you say, well, spring game doesn't really matter. He didn't have some of his best players. It's always a little bit weird when you can't get hit, which he was the only quarterback that was off limits. So I think it's difficult to draw anything concrete. I completely agree with their tight end room. I really like Colson Loveland. He's one of those, I think, uniquely athletic tight ends that I'm really, really excited about. His upside might be a little bit limited, as you mentioned, with Barner coming in, but maybe the one thing that stuck out to me a little bit and made a little bit of a joke about it in a chat that as someone who really hasn't had much of an opportunity to draft Blake Corum yet and hasn't gotten Donovan Edwards, great to see that Michigan just can't help but giving a linebacker goal line carries, and Mullings scoring that first touchdown. That's maybe one of those scenarios to just be aware of a little bit. Sometimes coaches and play callers can't help but get creative. Some might say too cute down by the goal line or in short yardage situations. And maybe you get somebody like Mullings who has sort of become a little bit of a short yardage specialist that is going to get more carries than he probably should have when you have what most would consider the top 1-2 running back combo in the country.
I am never going to be a head coach at the college football level. I'm never going to be an offensive play caller. I will say it drives me nuts when I see teams like Michigan and my own Georgia Bulldogs, when you get down near the goal line and you have guys like Colson Loveland, you have guys like AJ Barner, and you have incredible running backs. Why is play action to the tight end not one of your go-to plays right around the goal line? It drives me nuts every single time, especially when they run it. They just run it straight up the middle 3 times in a row, and then you kick the field goal. It drives me nuts. Anyway, completely off topic. That's pretty much all I had with the Michigan spring game. Let's go talk about a G5 spring game. They call it a scrimmage, but it was labeled as their spring game, whatever. Southern Miss, home of the illustrious Mr. Frank Gore Jr., who sat out the spring game. He was a healthy scratch. Of course, he is their golden goose. They are not going to risk him in a scrimmage like this. They know exactly what they have with him. 2 bits of information to note here. I know a lot of people liked Ryan Wilkie as the starting quarterback going into last year, was a guy that has some dual threat ability. The problem with him is that he doesn't seem like he's the starting quarterback anymore. It looks like that Clemson transfer, Billy Wiles, has started working with the first team, got all of the first team reps, in the scrimmage this past weekend while Wilkie was taking snaps with the second team. So that pretty much gives us a blank board of not knowing anything about what that quarterback position could look like for Southern Miss, which could either be a really good thing for a one Mr. Frank Gore or a really bad thing. The other thing that stuck out to me, I had no clue this had happened, and I'm glad that I did some research and found this out. Rodriguez Clark, that might be a name some of you might have forgotten about. That used to be one of the Memphis running backs that was in that absolute clog of running backs that they had in that backfield at one point. He transferred out, and he ended up here at Southern Miss during this game with Frank Gore out. 10 touches, 59 yards, 3 touchdowns. You can take away two things from that. One, you might be a bit more scared about Frank Gore and say, oh my God, they got 2 really good running backs now. Maybe that's going to cap Frank Gore's ceiling. I rather doubt it because Frank Gore, I think, is clearly the best guy on this roster. But this seems like the next guy up if Frank Gore were to leave after this season. It would make a lot of sense. They clearly are comfortable with using him as a workhorse back here. Again, getting him 3 different touchdowns, 2 goal line touches, I believe 1 20-yard plus run that got him into the end zone. So definitely a name to file away, especially if you're in a deep best ball league and you want to start in those later rounds looking for guys that are kind of handcuffs to your main guys up top. Clark seems like definitely the guy to get if you have Gore as one of your number 1 guys. Nick, your thoughts on the Southern Miss spring game here?
Yeah, this was one of those where I think, I try not to read too much into things. If I were to make my best guess on this quarterback situation and then also Drew Clark's emergence, neither is necessarily, the very best news for Frank Gore from a CFF perspective. If Clark, emerges as somebody you can depend on as a running back number 2, you're not going to have to rely on Gore for quite as heavy of a workload. And from, a Southern Miss just football perspective, that's something that they're really probably hoping for. I mean, Clark has right around 1,000 career rushing yards. So he's if he's able to be healthy, which has been a little bit of an issue recently, and he didn't play at all last year. I'm not sure. I don't remember if that was entirely injury related or if I think he maybe had entered the portal early and then just never. I don't know. I don't remember all the details. But if he's able to come in, you can take a little bit of that workload from Frank Gore, and that might limit Gore's upside just a little bit because they won't have to give him 25, 30 carries every week. And also if they get the quarterback situation figured out and can rely on some consistency at that position, well, then you won't have to have Frank Gore as what they call it, the super back. And that some of his biggest games from a scoring CFF scoring perspective have come when he's had multiple passing touchdowns as well as punching it in as a runner also. So I think Southern Miss, they do a great job of figuring it out and finding a way to be competitive, and Frank Gore's been a big part of that. And so I understand their coaching staff wanting to have to rely on him less, but if you're drafting Frank Gore as top 10 running back, this maybe isn't the best news if you're trying to read too much into it. But with him being draft eligible, not sure if he's going to jump necessarily, but I would expect that is a reason to think that, okay, they're going to give him the opportunity to carry a pretty heavy workload again, just in case this is it for him and he jumps up, makes a run at a professional career after this.
Yep. Alrighty, let's go ahead and move forward to the title of this show, an hour in. Let's finally talk about some of these hybrid players.
My bad. That's my fault.
Nah, it's all good, Nick. Again, there's a lot to get through today. Let's talk about some of these hybrid players. What we're going to do is we're not going to really name specific players, although some of these categories, like when we think of them, we are thinking of a very specific player, and we will definitely talk about that. But we're going to try to talk about them in a little bit of abstract terms, so not only can you apply them to this year, but maybe years in the future, maybe as guys shift throughout the rest of the offseason, maybe you can kind of think back to this pod and consider what we have been talking about here. I say we jump right into it, and we got to consider Again, it's important to consider this because, again, like, you have guys who will have unclear roles or just random dual eligibilities that can end up being broken sometimes. So, like, for those of you who might remember a couple years ago, the Jordan Myers fiasco, he was a tight end eligible player from Rice who ended up being treated like a running back by the staff. He had 92 carries, 338 yards, and 8 touchdowns, just completely broken for several weeks at the tight end position because you could effectively play a starting running back in your tight end position. So being aware of these things is very important, and also being aware of all these different guys and how it might affect them going forward. Anyway, first category here, we have the Swiss Army knife, we will call them. These are the guys that can basically play literally any position on the field. They're just fantastic athletes, and they're the guys that if a team doesn't have a lot of great options, these are the guys the coaching staff find creative ways to get the ball. And no other better example really than Jaheim Bell, the former tight end from South Carolina, currently at Florida State. Last year, Bell had 73 carries, 261 yards, and 3 touchdowns, along with 25 catches for 231 yards and 2 touchdowns. 73 carries for only 250 yards. Talk about some misutilization there. No wonder he left South Carolina. So when it comes to guys like this, Nick, these are the guys that I think are incredibly fun guys in especially best balls or just really leagues in general. If you don't grab one of the top tight ends that you know are going to be productive, these guys are a ton of fun because there's a ton of upside. You know there's going to be creative ways to get them touches, but there's also a lot of risk. Like, a lot of people were drafting Jaheim Bell last year. I don't think they were expecting him to get almost 100 touches, but only like less than 500 yards between everything. So your thoughts on this kind of player, Nick?
Well, so Bell is a pretty unique case. Obviously, basically split his snaps last year between running back and tight end, or running back and not running back, I guess. And so, that certainly has some value. One of the things that we look for, I'm taking part in the championship series, CFF champion series that Greg Brandt put together at the Devi Watch, where we have 12 different drafts, and it's 2 tight end and tight end premium. And so, we are all digging and trying to find, that Jordan Myers type guy that is going to be tight end eligible. Or, CJ Donaldson was, nobody really benefited from it last year because they were all best ball. Nobody knew, he was going to do what he did. But guys like that who are tight end eligible that have other avenues to become, just productive and score in a CFF format. And Bell is a really interesting one because he was basically forced into playing half his snaps at running back last year. You mentioned he transferred. That's a big piece of it. On the one hand, Florida State probably doesn't need him to take very many snaps at running back. They've got Trey Benson, they're deep there. Jordan Travis is certainly going to run, plenty at the quarterback position as well. But then Mike Norvell has been pretty creative in the past, spread the ball around to a lot of running backs, and utilize some guys that are primarily not running backs, give them carries as well. Most of it has been sort of hybrid wide receiver running back, type players in the past, but it could certainly, see some scenarios where Bell specifically, because he's shown that he can do it, and is, a heavier guy, a bigger back, hard to bring down in short yardage and goal line situations. I could see that he's potentially going to get some carries, but he's probably not going to come anywhere close to what he had last year. I would expect this move was maybe made in making him more, of a for his draft future, his NFL draft future at the tight end position, try to get him, show what he can do more there. But one thing to note, maybe his upside there from a CFF perspective is slightly limited as well, because Florida State brought in a really under the radar transfer in Kyle Morlock. Yeah. Division 2, shorter, Division 3 even, or NA, I don't know, down the list.
I would say way down there.
Right. And he's
a monster.
If you've seen any of his highlights, was a man amongst boys. So it'll be interesting to see how that translates, to the Power 5 FBS level. and if that impacts Jaheim Bell's tight end upside at all.
Alrighty. Fortunately, we have to move on and go ahead and start talking about some of these other guys. Next up here, we're going to be talking about running backs with a wide receiver eligibility. For those of you who have been doing best balls or really started taking a look at the player pool, you know exactly who I'm talking about. I'm talking about Mr. Jermaine Brown Jr. Within the CFF community, there is definitely a lot of debate over the upside of Jermaine Brown. Is he going to take over? Is he going to be Dwayne McBride 2.0? Is he limited? Regardless, let's take a look at if a guy like Jermaine Brown has wide receiver eligibility, how quite frankly broken that is. Just on his stats alone last year, where Brown had 948 yards and 8 touchdowns, along with 19 catches for 120 yards, that would have put him in the top 36 wide receivers last year for CFF. That was with him as the RB2. Let's go crazy here. Let's give him Dwayne McBride's stats from last year. Again, he's probably not Dwayne McBride, but let's just pretend that he is clearly Dwayne McBride 2.0. He would have been the wide receiver 1 last year, easily. It would have been him, it would have been Nathaniel Dell, and then there would have been a huge gap between them and everybody else. That is absolutely nuts. Pretty much when this is kind of the abstract part of the show I'll talk about here. When you're considering some of these guys with dual eligibilities and everything, there is pretty much a tier here. So if you can get a quarterback who plays quarterback, and you can put them in the running back, wide receiver, or tight end slot, that's pretty much a cheat code. Same with running backs. You can put them in the wide receiver or tight end spot, cheat code. Wide receivers, you put them in the tight end spot, cheat code right there. So you pretty much have that here with Jermaine Brown going in as a wide receiver. I think we're both in agreement, Nick, that this makes absolutely no sense why he still has this. The only reason why he has it in the first place is because he was a wide receiver coming out of high school, but he hasn't played wide receiver pretty much at any point in his time at UAB. Regardless, this is something that commissioners are going to have to consider moving forward. And quite frankly, is something I think people should take advantage of a little bit if the commissioner's not going to take care of this, or if Fantrax doesn't take care of it. So your thoughts, Nick?
Yeah, it can certainly be a tricky situation. I mean, I'm fully in the camp that Jermaine Brown should not be wide receiver eligible. He had 12 snaps as in a wide receiver position last year, 10 of those in the slot, 2 out wide, and I don't know 100% for sure, but I would wager that most of those are going to be motion out of the backfield, where he lined up as a running back and was just motioned out there. But if for whatever reason the league that you're in or the draft that you're in has Brown as a wide receiver eligible, and he is going to keep that throughout the year, certainly makes him a lot more valuable, in my opinion. If Brown specifically is only eligible at running back, I personally am out. He is not a top 10 round running back for me. The offensive line I don't like. I don't like the unknowns of a brand new coaching staff, new play caller, new head coach who've never coached at this level before. I just have absolutely no idea to what to expect. We should not assume he'll be anywhere close to Dwayne McBride. However, he does have a valuable skill set, has shown obviously some receiver skills, which has some value. But, if he gets that same stat line as last year, which I think is somewhat reasonable to expect, and he's wide receiver eligible, as you mentioned, what is that, top 30 wide receiver, then that's definitely valuable. And I would understand why he's being selected, round 7, round 8 at this point in most of the drafts that I've been in, at least. So it's a scenario where good to know if he's going to be able to keep that eligibility. Also good to know, who you're playing with and drafting with. I know that sometimes these eligibility issues can lead to some arguments and some hurt feelings at times, especially when one of these guys does develop into a cheat code. And if Brown over exceeds my expectations, he certainly could be in that category if he's wide receiver eligible.
Yeah, Jermaine Brown Jr. currently going as the running back 32 in drafts, going in the kind of mid to late 7th round for the most part, going around guys like George Holani, Roman Henby, a little bit after Jaden Ott, ahead of guys like Jalen White, EJ Smith out of Stanford, that kind of deal. Yeah, we're both pretty much in agreement that like this is something that has to be figured out, and maybe Fantrax takes care of it for us. They didn't last year with some of the guys, but we'll see. Let's go ahead and move on to, I'd say, a pretty quick conversation. This is just something I saw out of Syracuse notes that I thought was interesting. But you have Oronde Gadsden Jr., the wide receiver slash tight end hybrid. He only had wide receiver eligibility, but as far as the coaching staff was concerned, he was kind of a tight end hybrid. They're moving him to the outside. I just personally, with Oronde Gadsden, I don't think this should really affect your opinion whatsoever on him for the most part. I think this is just the staff trying to get their best players out on the field as much as possible. Gadsden is their best receiver. I think that, again, this is a short conversation for me. Don't worry about it. Gadsden's still the best player. They're going to feed him the ball pretty well. Don't worry too much about it. Nick, you have any thoughts here?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. I think that there is an argument to be made that maybe Gadsden should have tight end eligibility. I didn't expect that until I dug in the numbers, but he was an inline tight end and 80 plus snaps, which a lot of the tight ends these days, because guys are line up in the slot and are split out.
Yep.
Play around that same number. So maybe you make an argument if you want to make a stink, because he certainly, if he was a tight end last year, led the nation in yards, among tight ends, and that would certainly be super, super valuable. So maybe there's an argument to be made there, but sounds like they're going to move him around, and he's definitely going to be a big piece of that offense.
No, I think that's actually a great point. Again, if you're going to have some of these guys like Jermaine Brown Jr., who literally hasn't played wide receiver since he was getting his high school diploma, versus a guy who literally, as you said in the stats, shows that he is lining up as a tight end, but we don't have tight end eligibility for him. And this was something that people were talking about last year. Definitely an argument to be made there. Let's move on here. Let's go talk about some, unlike Jermaine Brown Jr., some running backs that are now kind of playing as wide receiver roles. The two guys that really kind of come to mind here are guys like Chris Tyree out of Notre Dame, who is officially moving to the slot wide receiver position. And then you have Raleek Brown, who was recruited as a running back, but it is pretty clear by his usage and by the way the coaches talk about him that he very much is a running back wide receiver hybrid for them. Nick, I'll let you start off on this one. Your thoughts on guys like this, and if there is any value to be had out of a player that plays like this.
So I don't think this necessarily matters much for these two players in particular, but I think it impacts other players on the roster. For Chris Tyree specifically, I think this is a good thing, if you're investing in that Notre Dame running back room, because now instead of potentially three guys sharing the workload, and Tyree was obviously number 3, but if it's only now a 2-man competition, or they go to Diggs, or is it Estime? My apologies for any mispronunciation there, but I feel better about one of those two guys really emerging as Notre Dame's workhorse running back, and maybe Estime might have the inside track to that right now. For Raleek Brown, who I love as a player and his skill set, probably not going to get a ton of production out of him. Mm-hmm. But if he's somebody who is going to see significant snaps in the slot, that comes into play a little bit when you're looking at that wide receiver group. And we're trying to find, who's the number 1, who's the number 2, how many of those guys are going to be productive. And if Brown is yet another piece of that puzzle, then it maybe limits the upside of somebody like Brendan Rice, who I like a lot. But he's just going to have to fight even more, for more targets, for more receptions, if Raleek Brown is a bigger piece of that puzzle, because USC did utilize him as a true freshman, threw him the ball a bit last year. And I would expect, because he's such a talented player and they want to find ways to get him involved, that he's going to be a factor. And so just something to consider when you're trying to sift through which, or, if you're trying to target those USC receivers, because we expect somebody to emerge as valuable out of that group.
I agree with you 100% about this impacting other players more than it is valuable for the players themselves. I told you about the tier earlier. Here, you would have a case of like players who are running backs moving down a tier. They'd be moving to wide receivers. So you'd have a guy who's playing wide receiver that you could play the running back position. That's just not nearly as valuable. We'll get to guys who are kind of the other way in a second here. Actually, I'll just go ahead and use that as a transition to move on to the next guys. Pretty much the opposite over here. So last we had running backs who are kind of transitioning or hybriding with the wide receiver position. Here you have former wide receivers who are moving over to the running back position. Two guys that come to mind here are guys like Tyrone Tracy at Purdue, as well as Dakarian Joyner at South Carolina. I don't know how much Dakarian Joyner is really going to play a factor in this year, but Tracy is kind of interesting. As we kind of alluded to earlier, it seems like he is solidifying himself as the clear number 2 running back over there at Purdue. And like Nick said earlier, their path might be through the run game in terms of its efficiency, considering what Graham Harrell was able to do last year. Again, going back to my tier, here you have guys that are probably going to get both wide receiver and running back eligibility due to the way that they have played in college so far. If Tyrone Tracy is a number 2 running back with wide receiver eligibility, I don't think he's close enough to where like he is a must draft, like, oh, he's going to be an absolute cheat code, but it's something you have to consider. Because again, a number 2 running back could be better than a lot of wide receivers that you could be drafting in later rounds. And it could be, and again, Devin Mockabee goes down, all of a sudden Tyrone Tracy is the number 1 back for Purdue, then you do have a cheat code as far as I'm concerned. So definitely, again, going back to that tier, got to be something you consider. Nick, your thoughts on guys like this?
Well, I think it the main consideration is similar, to the previous conversation, how it impacts other guys, and maybe Devin Mockabee, who came out of nowhere and was really, really productive last year, and understandably, people excited that he would be a draftable asset at this point. Tyrone Tracy, hasn't been super productive, but he was somebody that got a lot of us excited last year when it looked like he was going to be a big part of the passing game there. So I think it's possible that he takes some snaps away, some carries away, some touches away from Mockabee. And then, as you mentioned, if Mockabee goes down, hopefully, of course, that doesn't happen. But Tracy was a bigger body wide receiver, or not tall, but a little thicker. Could potentially be somebody who proves himself valuable at the running back position. Joyner, it sounds like, is more of a case of the South Carolina running back group just being really, really shorthanded right now. But I think it's important to note, as a former quarterback, as somebody who has taken snaps as a Wildcat quarterback in the past, he might be one of those where maybe they carve out a role for him in short yardage and goal line situations, kind of poaches some touchdowns from whoever were to emerge as the every down running back. But also, and I know it's a different play caller at South Carolina this year, but we didn't expect Jaheim Bell, to be an impact performer at the running back position last season. And whether the stats actually, show that he was super valuable, he at least was a factor there. And so maybe Joyner, ends up taking some of the carry workload that Bell had last year.
Our next category of guys, which are wide receivers with tight end eligibility, the main guy that comes to mind here is Dalvin Smith, who, if he keeps his tight end eligibility, in my opinion, is a super undervalued player in college fantasy going on right now. Here's why. You were talking again, going back to the hierarchy. You got a wide receiver playing tight end. Wide receivers are infinitely more valuable than, or you got a wide receiver who has tight end eligibility. That means you could put a wide receiver in your tight end spot. Let's look at some players who played for Western Kentucky last year, because Dalvin Smith will be one of the starting wide receivers for Western Kentucky this upcoming year. Dawood Davis scored 141.3 fantasy points last year. That would have put him as the tight end 4. Just with Dalvin Smith's stuff last year, he's not even a starter as a wide receiver. With Dalvin Smith's stats last year, where he had 35 catches, 443 yards, and 4 touchdowns. That would have had him be the tight end 22. Now, let's say worst case scenario, he's a starting wide receiver. He's a wide receiver 3. That puts him in Jaren Hall range. That also would have put him at the tight end 4. Vastly, again, this is a little bit of a cheat code right here. And again, if Fantrax doesn't take care of it, if your commissioner doesn't take care of it, you have to be on the lookout for a guy like Dalvin Smith. So, Nick, your thoughts on Dalvin Smith and just wide receivers with tight end eligibility?
Yeah, first, in my opinion, Dalvin Smith should not have wide receiver or shouldn't have tight end eligibility. He played 13 snaps in line last year.
He should not, but he does.
But if he does, then absolutely. I mean, he's probably going to be very valuable and is currently under rated regardless, because you mentioned David Davis and Jalen Hall. Those guys combined for 202 targets last year. So if it's Corley and then some combination of Smith and Michael Matheson as that wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3, you can expect him, to be in line for in the neighborhood of 100 targets this year. And then, certainly plenty of opportunities for touchdowns. He's a bigger target. That I think has some value, of course, in the red zone. So it's Dalvin Smith specifically is probably being underdrafted right now. And if he keeps his tight end eligibility, which he probably shouldn't, but if he does, yeah, absolutely. That's he's in line for a huge year. If we're talking tight end number 1 type stat line, if he were to reach the sort of production that Hall and Davis got.
One more point I did want to make here is the fact that, again, if you're in a best ball, this is what we're talking about with taking advantage of some of these eligibility things is only available in redraft, because a lot of best balls, they do primary position only. And a lot of times that puts them in the correct position. So like Dalvin Smith in best balls is going as a wide receiver. He's not a tight end as well. It does mess up things for a guy like Ben Sano, who is a tight end, but they have as a running back right now. We'll see if that all gets fixed. In a very similar vein, this category and the next 2 are very similar in what we're talking about. So I'll be sure to try to explain the differences between all of them. We had a guy who is a wide receiver full-time who is has tight end eligibility for some reason. Now we're going to talk about guys who were wide receivers and are now moving to tight end. Specifically, the guy that comes to mind here is Antonio Harmon, the wide receiver out of Mississippi State. Very unproductive year last year, 5 catches, 61 yards, 0 touchdowns. A lot of people are actually pretty excited about him because he was listed as a potential starting wide receiver for the Mississippi State air raid system, but clearly that did not pan out. But he is now moving over to tight end. Very slim tight end, unless he has put on some weight that I have not seen reports of yet. 6'3", 215 pounds. It's always interesting because this means that he is going to be a good pass catching tight end option, which is something you want to look for tight end guys that you're looking for in CFF. The problem is I don't see how this is going to be a seamless transition for him. He was a guy, if I remember correctly, who was playing on the outside of this system. He is a guy, like I said, he's very slimly built. He has not been trained at the tight end position. We'll definitely see, but Nick, do you have any thoughts here?
Well, I just think it's important to remember that 2023 Mississippi State is not, the Mississippi State that we've gotten used to the last couple of years.
True. I should have been more clear about that.
Really, really big shift in their offensive philosophy. Now a defensive minded head coach. It could certainly be valuable, the tight end position sometimes in offenses that, move in this direction. Sometimes that's a good thing for tight ends. There's not a great example that comes to mind immediately for this type of transition. The closest might have been last year with Washington State, where they went from the run and shoot for several years, not having any tight ends off of the roster, to just trying to find a couple of guys to line up at tight end, and nobody was anywhere close to fantasy relevant there. So a little bit different offense. Maybe this transition will benefit somebody like Harmon. Again, my apologies, because he certainly does have a talent profile that makes him an attractive option. if he's able to become a full-time tight end. But they're just a lot of unknowns, and the best example that I can think of in recent history, which is not even that good of an example, didn't translate to fantasy relevant tight end. So something to be aware of, but not necessarily don't go out drafting Harmon as a top 20, top 30 even tight end today just because he's a wide receiver who's now tight end eligible potentially. Doesn't always work out.
It definitely would be a lot better if Harmon was like one of the top 3 wide receivers. Like we knew he was one of the best wide receivers on the team and it was making this transition. But no, he was clearly a guy that was kind of buried last year for the most part. Other guys kind of jumped him on the depth chart. This seems like a move just to get him out on the field just a little bit more. Another category here, like I said, the last 2 were very similar to this one, but this is everybody's favorite type of tight end in CFF, and that is just straight up big wide receivers that are playing the tight end role. Guys that come to mind here: Bryson Nesbitt, Corey Dyches are the 2 that immediately came to mind for me. Jake Brenningstool at Clemson is another one I'm kind of thinking off the top of my head here. It's a good example. And then a lot of people, Deuce Robinson, just committed to USC. He's going to be, I think, another one of these guys that is playing a similar role if the Dodgers don't draft him in this upcoming MLB draft. But again, this is the kind of thing that you want in CFF. These are the guys that are going to be included in the passing game. They're not going to be asked to block a whole ton because that is not their job really at the end of the day. They are designed to provide mismatches for their offenses. And honestly, like, he's a good blocker, but like I'd almost throw Brock Bowers in this category as well because he is not quite as big as a typical tight end normally is. Like, Darnell Washington's just an absolute monster last year, and Bowers was the smaller but shiftier guy out there playing the exact same position out on the field. So this to me is like when you are researching your tight ends and you're researching the guys that you're going to take shots on after guys like Bowers and Keithy come off the board, and you're looking at the round plus 10 guys, look for guys that are playing this kind of role. I think this is by far you're going to be your best hit rate in terms of guys you can rely on week in and week out for their offenses, at least as a good solid floor, because both Nesbitt and Dyches were both top 30 tight end guys last year easily. Nick, your thoughts on this kind of category of hybrid players?
Yeah, I'm a sucker for this type of tight end. I'm not super outwardly vocal on stumping for guys a lot, but one that I have in the past and sort of annoyingly so was Cole Turner at Nevada, just because he was a big wide receiver. And, just knowing how they utilized him down the red zone going into the 2021 season, I was, standing on the table, he should be tight end one, and certainly got some pushback and it worked out decently well. I think he finished as tight end 3 that year. Neither of these guys are exactly in that same situation. Bryson Nesbitt, I think, is even more athletic. I think he has the higher upside in some ways because even though there's a new play caller at North Carolina, you have one of the top quarterbacks in the country in Drake May, and you have a lot of vacated targets and receptions, fantasy points in that receiving core. And Bryson Nesbitt is athletic enough to line up all over the field. It sounds like, in the early practice reports, whether you love Chip Lindsey as a play caller or not, and most people don't, quite honestly, I have to expect that, he's smart enough to realize that Bryson Nesbitt is one of the more talented players that he's got at his disposal and needs to find ways to get him involved more often than not. So the fact that, North Carolina does have Kamari Morales at tight end, some might see that as, there's two tight ends mouths to feed. Well, I see it as a little bit of a positive because Kamari Morales, you can have him play more of the traditional tight end. You can have Bryson Nesbitt, move him around a little bit as that chess piece, become really more of a starting wide receiver, even if it's technically 12 personnel. He's talented enough that I if I were calling plays, and certainly I'm not, but he's somebody who's going to be maybe the number one target option this year. I think he's certainly in the conversation. I don't think that's completely outlandish to say. And Deuce Robinson is a true freshman. I know that some people are going to say, why in the world would you even waste your time? He might even play, might get drafted, as you mentioned, isn't in for spring, won't even show up until the fall. But you know what? USC, and we talked about it with Raleek Brown, we don't necessarily know how that pecking order is going to work out in that receiver room. If you can find the guy who's going to be super valuable, you're going to really potentially hit a home run there. And USC was the perfect landing spot for Deuce Robinson because they are incredibly thin at the tight end position.
And Malcolm Epps just left.
Exactly. And, Lake McCree is really the only guy who's played any significant time. He was a very small tight end. Robinson was even listed as a wide receiver in his, official welcome to USC, whatever. But he's 6'6", 230, something like that. He, I believe, in my opinion, and I'm not a recruiting expert, but he's somebody that I've, seen a little bit of and just fell in love with immediately. He has such a unique skill set that he could step on the field and, he could learn 4 plays, 4 routes, and he's going to be valuable because he, when USC moves into the red zone, the green zone, whatever you call it, and they're looking for touchdown plays, they don't have a 6'6" guy on that roster. It's not Mario Williams, it's not Taj Washington, it's not even Lake McCree, who's 6'4". So even if he doesn't, even if he shows up on campus the day before the first game, I think that Deuce Robinson could be valuable because I think Lincoln Riley is smart enough to say, all right, this is a unique physical specimen that we don't have anywhere else in the offense. Here are your 3 plays, run down, and we'll throw a little jump pass to you in the end zone, and he might end up with 7, 8, 9 touchdowns if you do that over the course of a full season. So he might not be an every down asset. He's probably not going to get a ton of targets all season, ton of receptions all season. He might. Maybe he's just that special. But I think at the very least, he's somebody who's going to come in and assuming he doesn't just say, oh, I'm playing baseball. Sorry, USC, which is a possibility. It's a risk. But I think,
I personally think that's what's going to happen.
You know what? That's fine. Me personally, especially these like 2 tight end premium drafts I'm in, best balls, I am not leaving Deuce Robinson undrafted in any draft I'm in the rest of the year, because the upside is double-digit touchdowns. He might have 20 catches and 10 touchdowns, but in some of these drafts where tight end plays especially an even bigger role than it normally would, and that's me personally, that's a big piece of the drafts I'm in right now. So maybe I'm in a different situation than most. But I think that his potential upside is massive, even if he doesn't play but a couple hundred snaps a year. If you play 0, then I missed out. Sorry. And if you did what I'm doing, if you take this as advice, I'm sorry. But I just think he's going to, maybe he rolls up August 1st and they're just going to say, hey, go catch us some touchdown passes. I think they're just going to have some value.
One point I want to rewind a little bit. We're going back a couple minutes here. I want to talk about Bryson Nesbitt again here real quick. I haven't been super high on Bryson Nesbitt. I have a crazy thought here. This is a crazy thought, so don't take me too seriously, y'all. This may not make any kind of sense whatsoever, but we're all not huge fans of Chip Lindsey. Part of that is because of how much he spreads the ball around to different playmakers. But like Nick said, the top guys are moving on. Downs, Green, really Nesbitt is the number 1 pass catcher coming back from last year. Yes, we're not going to see Nesbitt get 1,000 yards or anything like that. I don't think that's really anybody's expectation for any tight end, but that's the point. Nesbitt is a tight end. If he's spreading this around, yes, the top guys, the ceiling of the top receiving options on USC, I think are going to come down. I don't think we see a UNC wide receiver break 1,000 yards this year. But that next tier of guys, the guys like Nesbitt, the guys like Pacor, Blackwell, the J.J. Joneses and everything, who were getting like 300, 400, 500 yards last year, because everything's being spread around so much, they're getting more opportunities. And so you might see them bump up a little bit. I think we could see Nesbitt easily clear his 500 yards from last year and 4 touchdowns and 35 catches just on that dynamic alone. So that's just kind of my crazy thought. We'll see if that goes anywhere. One last category we have to cover here are everybody's least favorite players in the history of fantasy, and that is the touchdown vultures. Specifically, the most annoying kind, the ones with eligibility, position eligibility that you can't take advantage of. Some examples that come to mind here are DJ Lundy, the linebacker at Florida State, Dylan Doyle, the defensive player at Baylor, JJ, and guys like that. But there are a few out there that we have been able to take advantage of. Princeton Fant at Tennessee was somebody that comes to mind. He had tight end eligibility, and he would be given goal line carries all the time, especially in games where Tennessee was expected to win by a ton. They always found a way to get him a touchdown. Ole Miss might be interesting here, as kind of Nick alluded to earlier when we talked about Ole Miss. They're not afraid to be creative around the goal line. And JJ Pegues, who was formerly a tight end before he came to Ole Miss, he's currently a defensive lineman. Definitely somebody who can take a handoff at the goal line. He did have 1 carry and 1 catch last season, so I don't think he's going to be somebody that we're seeing over and over again, but he is one of the more consistently talked about defensive players on Ole Miss's team. So if they want to get him some good draft capital, I imagine they find some creative ways to get him involved in the offense. Nick, your overall thoughts on these touchdown vultures? And really, again, the main takeaway here is you just got to know which teams involve this a ton.
Yeah, a lot of the things that I've talked about today, and it's part of my philosophy just in general, is just to be aware, to just know situations, to know context. And this is one of those things, knowing, like a lot of especially the C2C group I know loves Damian Martinez, right? And understandably so. I like him a lot too. Drafted him pretty high early on this year, but Oregon State also has a history of giving, quarterback / linebacker / fullback those goal line snaps. And so it's just, are we going to see that this year? Is Jack Coletto, since, he's out of eligibility, he's no longer a factor, but is somebody else taking that role? I know they've moved, a former defensive player, edge defender, to the tight end position. Is he somebody that we have to worry about getting goal line carries? Not sure, but it's possible. Baylor has done this. You mentioned Dylan Doyle, who has also moved on, but, does that limit somebody like Richard Reese, who's already, not as high on draft boards as a lot of us might expect? It's just something to be aware of. If you get 4th and 1, middle of the field, but you also get those, down by the goal line, guys who are going to get those type of carries. Pegues, has had touchdown passes or receptions in the past. So it's just being aware of what are some of the teams that utilize defensive players in goal line packages, or how Harold Fannin is a tight end who ran 4 touchdowns last year. Mm-hmm. He particularly could be pretty valuable. Whoever is going to take over for Princeton Fant, if that's a role in the offense at Tennessee next year, could be valuable. Is it one of the transfer tight ends that they've had, coming in? Does Jacob Warren, just sort of step into that role? Not sure. Does it benefit the running backs who, maybe they get a little bit more goal line use, even though Jalen Wright and Jabari Small both had double-digit touchdowns last year. Maybe those guys, get a point or two extra value because they don't have to worry about a Princeton Fant taking away even more touchdowns. Or you've got a 6'6", 250-pound quarterback in Joe Milton, who I've been drafting, particularly high, and am very high on him for CFF this year. Is he somebody that's, going to see a lot of goal line usage? Hendon Hooker had 5 rushing touchdowns last year. Princeton Fant had 5 rushing touchdowns last year. Maybe Joe Milton, is a candidate for double-digit
Could be.
rushing touchdowns next year. It's possible. So not a whole lot of like, slam dunk, draft this guy because he plays this position, except maybe Fannin.
If Fannin might be interesting.
But it's just, I think there is some value in being aware of these situations and how that could impact guys that you're drafting, and whether or not maybe it's a tiebreaker for two players that you view similarly, and one may not have to worry about somebody poaching a touchdown down by the goal line.
No, I think that's a very good point. Again, you brought up Damian Martinez. Like, let's look at where Damian Martinez is going. He's the RB10. Who would you rather have if you're kind of considering that? Would you rather have Trey Benson, who he might have to worry about, like, Jaheim Bell, Johnny Wilson being 6'7",
Travis.
But like Saban Guerra, who does Saban Guerra have to worry about? Curtis Rourke. That's kind of a normal dynamic that you would expect in some teams. You have to worry about the quarterback. Kavorian Barnes. I mean, Frank Harris obviously there, but like LaDamian Webb. Who's vulturing from LaDamian Webb? That's something you got to consider there. Frank Gore Jr. Who's vulturing from Frank Gore Jr. right now? Again, maybe you got Rodriguez Clark, but Frank Gore I think is a bigger back. So like, why would you put Clark out there? Marquez Cooper. Who's vulturing from him at Ball State? It's a good point, Nick. Like, it is something that you can use to kind of break the tie between a lot of guys, especially at the quarterback position as well. Again, the most unfortunate thing about a lot of these touchdown vultures, like you kind of touched on briefly, is that there's not a lot of eligibility exploitation that you can kind of have with these guys. A lot of times, like Jack Colletto, he was a quarterback-only eligible dude. If he had a running back, if he had wide receiver eligibility, you might have been able to take advantage of that, especially if he had tight end eligibility as well. Might have been able to take advantage of that. Mike Wright this year, expected to be a goal line package guy for Mississippi State. You can't really take advantage of that, because why would you play a quarterback like Mike Wright and hope he gets some packages in a game versus playing, I don't know, an actual quarterback? So that's kind of the unfortunate part of it all. But lots of things to discuss and a lot of different things that you have to consider when you're planning for your CFF seasons. And that pretty much brings us to the end of our show. Nick, you have been absolutely awesome. What a great start to CFF, or to CTN guest month over here. You've been absolutely, like I said, you've been absolutely incredible. I pretty much have gushed about a lot of your content already. I know you also have a podcast, so why don't you tell the people what it is you guys discuss over on that podcast?
Yeah, the CFB Winning Edge podcast, we have been talking a lot about returning production. We talk about football sort of as a whole, both offense and defense, and try to provide a lot of context, as a lot of the points I brought up today, coaching changes, how that can impact teams. It's more on the team level. We do team projections, some information that folks might find useful for betting purposes. We had a really, really strong last couple of years in our over-under win total projections. Also had a good year for single game line projections last season. But we definitely do talk about college football as a whole there. But the biggest impact, I think, maybe the most valuable thing that we offer are the Google Sheets that you mentioned. Try to keep track of personnel as well as we possibly can, returning production, who's going in, who's going out. You mentioned the eligibility, kind of try to keep track of that for dynasty purposes, just for our own purposes. We try to track as much of the personnel equation as possible at CFB Winning Edge, patreon.com/CFB Winning Edge, if you're interested in that sort of thing, and reach out to me if you have any questions, at any time. And I'm sure, the conversation we touched on a lot of people, and I certainly am not always brief. So I know we ran long today, but I'm sure we missed some folks as well, some potential impact hybrid players. So reach out if anybody's got any questions about players like that, or want to point out somebody that we should have mentioned. I'm always happy to chat with folks who are listening, and especially the people that support us.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great way to segue into a reminder. Again, if you want to follow myself on Twitter, I'm at CFF_Jared. You can ask me questions just like with Nick. His Twitter is at CFBWinningEdge, just like the name of his stuff. You can also follow the podcast at Chasing the Natty. A lot of our announcements and stuff like that for upcoming stuff will be made over there, so make sure you are following that for all of the content over there. Again, keep it with us here at campus2canton.com. Lots and lots of great stuff coming your way. We got this, guest month all throughout the rest of this month. We're going to have different people coming on and helping us get through these spring games. In addition to that, we got the CFF Ranking Summit that'll be coming to you from the Campus of Canton YouTube channel. We'll be live streaming that. It'll be myself, Nate, Chris, Kay, and Justice will be going on there discussing our rankings for CFF, and we're also going to be putting each other on trial for some of our outrageous rankings. So that was a ton of fun last year. It's going to be a ton of fun again this year. Lots and lots of other great stuff. So like I said, keep it with us over here at campus2canton.com and Chasing the Natty. Really appreciate you guys all listening, and you guys will have a wonderful and blessed day. See y'all.